On the one hand, they very much focus on collective actions that acknowledge and value the relevance, but also the critical role of cities as political spaces for transformative change. And this is very important because here we are not just talking about experiences that take cities as islands of reform, but very much that carve space, open the cracks through these political processes. The second important aspect to highlight is that the emphasis has been typically on collective actions that focus on securing access to, but also control over, a wide range of habitat-related human rights, whether it's about energy, water, land, food, housing, and so on. And in doing so, the initiatives that are part of the Atlas and of the award are vibrant examples of collective action as a process that simultaneously claims those rights, but also activates the social function of cities within and beyond their boundaries. Another important thing to highlight is the democratic character of the Transformative Award. As you know, this is a People's Choice Award, and that means that the general public have the possibility of learning about these initiatives and also on deciding which ones are the winners. Most importantly, the emphasis of the process is not on best practices. And I think that this is also something that makes the discussion today by the Transformative Cities Award very different from other things that we might have around. The emphasis is much more on a critical reflection and learning from the victories, but also the challenges. I wouldn't say the failures, but the challenges that these initiatives face. So, in short, the Transformative Cities Award aims to recognize the collective efforts that are carving creative pathways to set cities in a counter-hegemonic path and to develop collective capabilities to sustain impactful change through those pathways and over time. So without further delay, I want to introduce a wonderful panel. We have 4 amazing speakers, and they're all working and part of organizations that were either the winners or finalists in the housing category of the People's Choice Award for 2018-2020. So I'm going to ask you, as I mentioned, as I named you, I'm going to start from Heather, and I'm going to ask the panelists to just wave so that you can see them. Heather Kirby is a Professor Emeritus of International Politics and Public Policy at the University of Limerick and a visiting professor at the University of Valencia in Spain. He has lived in Clough Jordan Village, Eco-Village since 2009, where he served as a member of the board of directors between 2015 and 2019. And he's currently the coordinator of the Eco-Village education program. He has published extensively. I very much recommend to check his publications, and his most recent book was published in 2021, but you will see that the common denominator across his publications has to do with trying to seek how to transform a market society in the era of climate change. We also have Lucia Ortiz from Casanat, Porto Alegre, Brazil. Welcome, Lucia. Lucia is an environmental justice activist, and she's the current president of Friends of the Earth in Brazil. She has worked for over 2 decades building the movement for system change based on international solidarity and learning from popular feminist and ecological emancipatory initiatives such as Casanat. The initiative of Casanat is based in Porto Alegre city and is a space and permanent process of resistance and transformation. And this is how Casanat defines itself. Again, welcome, Lucia, and thank you for joining us today. We also have David Gabriel from Next Planning in Grenoble, France. Gabriel is also an activist. He's a visual artist, a social worker, and an urban planner. He has been the director of Next Planning since 2012, and over the years, he has actively participated in the implementation of a community organizing approach to strengthen the empowerment and empower practices of inhabitants in working class neighborhoods in Grenoble. He's also the founder of the Atelier Populaire d'Urbanisme de la Villeneuve, and participates in the elaboration of a strategic and democratic urban project, the conception of such a project as an alternative to social housing demolition. And last but not least, we have with us Isadora Hastings from Cooperación Comunitaria AC in Mexico. Isadora is one of the founding members of Cooperación Comunitaria AC, and since 2010, she's also its director. Cooperación Comunitaria AC works on a comprehensive and from a comprehensive methodology for improving living conditions and increasing the resilience of rural and indigenous communities across Mexico. And from the organization that she leads, we can see that she promotes community development processes for habitat recovery in rural areas across the country, and works with other local organizations to focus on the social production of habitat and construction with local materials and self-management of the territory. So a wonderful panel, as you can see. And perhaps just to say that, I mean, we're going to have, the structure is very simple. We're going to have 2 rounds of discussions for the panels to put some ideas and thoughts on the table, and then we're going to open the debate, not necessarily for questions and answers, but very much for you all to also share your experiences. I just want to say that the 4 panelists are not necessarily going to focus on describing the initiatives that made them finalists or winners of Transformative Cities, but very much talk much more about the underlying processes and the underlying challenges, if you wish, that those initiatives were trying to tackle. So I'm going to start with Isadora, if that's okay. The question for the first panel round of the panel discussion is what are the specific challenges, or I would say fights, that targeted by your organization and your work, and what do you see as the root drivers of such challenges that we need to keep sight of? Isadora, the floor is yours. We have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you, and hello everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. And well, I speak in Spanish. Sorry, I feel more comfortable to say all this problematic thing that we solve through Cooperación Comunitaria.
In Cooperación Comunitaria, AC, as Adriana already said, Cooperación Comunitaria, we work to recover and rebuild traditional rural housing in Mexico, and we do this through a comprehensive system which encompasses territorial, productive, and environmental aspects. So I'd like to start off by saying that Mexico is a country with a huge cultural diversity, where the housing solutions that have been built throughout history respond to and are adapted to the different regions and the different climates and geologies of the country, and also adapting to the culture in the area. And for many years, in recent decades, these traditional housing have been devalued or lost value because of several situations. On the one hand, because of colonialism, which always has made a large chunk of the population to suffer discrimination and racism and classism against rural population and against indigenous populations in Mexico. And with all of this, all of the constructive and productive processes that have been built over centuries of experience. So this new colonialism that we are living now through capitalism, we find extractivist industries that displace communities from their land and want to turn these communities from being producers into consumers. And this also displaces housing because they introduce industrialized materials which displace the more natural materials, which because these industrial materials in theory are more resistant, but they are displacing traditional building materials. Mexico, also because of its geographical position, is threatened by natural disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, etc., etc. There are many threats which obviously affect the population, and obviously the effects of climate change also contribute to this situation and make rural populations more vulnerable. And these rural communities live in the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific coast and the southern coast. And these natural disasters have led to the destruction of all of this built cultural heritage, that is the housing, which in the Mexican housing policies, we must recall that in the 80s, the housing policy changed. The state stopped building social housing and was merely a facilitator and passed on the responsibility of constructing social housing to private corporations, which obviously focus on economic gains more than trying to improve the quality of life of the most needy population. So in this regard, in the reconstruction, we've had private companies with industrial materials, with housing prototypes and models that do away with this traditional housing, which is the cultural and economic heritage of the people. We know that these industrial materials such as steel and cement come from some of the most polluting industries in the world. And having these materials brought into these places leads to greater CO2 emissions and an energy expenditure. So we can also see environmental aspects, and they displace the more sustainable housing construction materials. So by displacing traditional constructive materials that are sustainable, we don't only do away with this heritage, they're also displacing knowledge related to finding solutions that are much more adapted to the physical and cultural context of the families, and they do away with the constructive wealth and all of the knowledge that has been developed over so many years to build adequate housing for each region in the different communities in the countries. I'd leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Isadora, and also for just giving us such a rich and complex picture in 5 minutes. So very important elements that I'm sure we are going to go back to throughout the question, particularly in identifying the drivers of this situation and of your fight. So you talk about racism and systematic discrimination of indigenous and rural communities and how it manifests from this changing them as consumers, from producers to become consumers. You talk about clearly with that as forms of neocolonialism. Also very important take on climate change and the very non-natural construction and usufruct over disasters, so-called disasters. And of course, how all these crises and drivers are very much coupled with the neoliberalization of housing policies, creating even further layers of this protection. So a very clear picture of, you know, what is the space, what is a fight that Cooperación Comunitaria is really fighting and working very concretely on the ground. Thanks for that. David, I'm going to invite you to come next with us. And again, please, just for everyone listening, we cannot see you, but please remember that we welcome not just questions, but also comments and thoughts that come to you. David, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Adriana. Voy a hablar en español también.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I'll also be speaking in Spanish. Hello, everyone. I'm extremely happy to be here, Fearless Cities, and this panel. 4 years after the first event, which was extremely important to build a new way of municipalities in France, and also a new way of relationships between and among social movements. I work in Villeneuve, in Grenoble, and this is based on the ideas of Henri Lefebvre. It's the result of Hubert Toubidoux, mayor of Grenoble, and also due to an architecture and urban planning cooperative. They have managed to have over 2,000 schools, social centers, healthcare centers, cultural spaces, and also spaces as an alternative to the capitalist city. I've been working in this neighborhood for 10 years, and I've been experimenting with community organizing. The main issue for us is how to create nowadays new communities of change at a local scale, but with a global impact, also including marginalized people and the poorest. They can contribute to urban planning so that the cities are fairer and more and greener as well. Of course, our experience is very similar to many other experiences throughout the world. Exchanges from the World Social Forums, and for years there's been a great community who's been trying to change their own cities and their own municipalities and their own world, actually. So the problems that we've met, well, mainly the capitalist production system. This also includes the housing system. This is what we need to change. When we started at Villeneuve in this historical neighborhood, the idea was to have a neoliberal refurbishment project similar to many other policies in France. The state is actually destroying social housing. Why are they doing this? Because they are an alternative to the market. And the spaces dedicated to housing are strategic spaces for the cities. So they want to kick people out. They want to privatize public services and transform public property into private property. So the destruction of housing, that was one of the main problems that we found. This was also done in a very aggressive way. There had been families living in those buildings for a long time, and these evictions are a very brutal process, very violent for families, and in local urban planning and in globalization as well. There are many types of these evictions. Like Saskia Sassen said, evictions, brutality, and complexity in global economy, they're now a paradigm to city building. So these destruction processes are the processes that we're trying to fight. This process comes from a local and national building and planning policy done by the Urban Refurbishing Agency, where they promote a type of policy which pretty much affects mostly certain neighborhoods where they're mostly migrants from second and third generation, tons of people from Northern Africa. And these expulsions processes have to do with post-colonial processes.
David, I think that I don't know if we lost a bit.
Problème.
Sorry, I don't know if it is just my connection, but I lost David. Yes, you did as well. Okay, I think that he was just...
Disculpa.
Disculpa,
Entonces,
David. Te perdimos por las últimas palabras.
David, we missed some of the last sentences. If you can repeat and also start concluding.
Adelante. Si quieres, simplemente perdimos unos segundos. Si quieres repetir.
We just missed the last few words. If you can repeat. Yes, so sorry. Technical problems. So as I was saying, I will end my presentation with this idea that this policy to destruct and destroy public housing has to do with post-colonial periods. These have affected mostly migrant neighborhoods. In my opinion, solidarity that we should have with this struggle against the capitalist production system in the cities has to be a solidarity among popular neighborhoods and other spaces within the same city so that we can create new ways of living within our cities.
Many thanks, David. We went a bit over, so I'm going to be very brief, and then we can connect more of the dots that you have put on the table. But we can, I mean, it's worth noticing how in a very different context and apparent problematic, the similarities and the commonalities with the struggles that Isadora was presenting before, both in terms of the, if you wish, the complicity of the state and its policies in propelling a system that is violent, that is brutal, that is exclusionary. And very interesting here as well to see again how initiatives like the one that Next Planning is pushing for are creating another possibility of a city, both in very material and very intangible ways. So that's something common to all. I'm going to now invite Lucia Ortiz from Casanat.
Muchas gracias, buenos días.
Thank you very much. Thank you, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Pleasure to be here with all of you again to explore in more depth the context and the possibilities of internationalist solidarity that we can all have together to defend our emancipatory ideas to change the system. So I will be talking about Casanat. This is the headquarters of Friends of the Earth in Brazil, in Porto Alegre in Brazil. This is the capital of one of the southernmost state in Brazil. Many millions of people live there, and the World Social Forums were created there. Actually, they were born there. So Casanat was an abandoned building. It was owned by the state, and it was ceded to the organization in 2004 to be used for the public interest, to be a place of work, articulation of movements for the organization, and also to be a center of documentation of the environmental justice movement. We have an archive dating from the 70s, actually way before the creation of Friends of the Earth, which is almost 50 years old. So we have these very useful space. This was also to be used for social technologies fair, pedagogical, different ways of using these spaces within the city. We also have sustainable urban planning, solar energy. We also have the refurbishing of local materials, natural resources, painting. This is also a space where before the pandemic, we would have the fair Frutos de la Resistencia, which was used to promote agroecology, and also it was also used for movement articulation. So with all of these strategies and organizations, our idea was to be able to discuss and from concrete examples to advance on public policies for the city, for the rights of people, but in the city. So I've been talking about what we've been doing. The main problem that we find now is fascism and violence of neoliberal capitalism, which is also misogynist, racist, classist, and particularly within the pandemic, we find ourselves in a systemic crisis. It's also a genocide system. Brazil is the country in the world with the highest level of deaths per day. We have, in the last 24 hours, 1,600 deaths. And Brazil, only 14% of the population is vaccinated. And over 500 million infected people. 84,000 people might be evicted despite the housing that has been built by human rights defenders, and with massive campaigns called Despejo Zero, zero evictions. These people have been trying to push for a draft bill, which is actually now in the Senate because it's trying to stop evictions. In this same context, in Casanat, we are under also an eviction process led by the national due to the destatization of the Bolsonaro government. We're also under attacks by micro initiatives that we push forward in the pandemic, like helping people during the pandemic in vulnerability. For instance, homelessness has increased in 30%, by 30% with the pandemic. So this is the current context for us. And this is why it's so important for us to be able to exchange and also to think and to talk about other initiatives about constructing the system. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to hear more about these. Thank you.
Many thanks, Lucia. Again, lots of commonalities and the question of violence and the sources of violence, and you mentioned many, no? Classism, racism, misogynism, and even something that needs to be called as a genocide, real genocide, not only in the context of Brazil. We're going to come back to many of the initial points. I just want to remind ourselves that it's quite, why we are talking about fearless cities, and clearly we are talking about fearless cities because we are talking about very brutal and violent process that requires not victims, not collectives that position themselves or are supported as victims, but very much that work, move together, collectivize with a great degree of being fearless. I'm going to move very quickly now to invite Peder. Peder, the floor is yours.
I'm sorry, I was muted, yes. As I was saying, when we were set up 22 years ago, it was as a way of modeling the transition towards a post-carbon society. The problem we identified at the beginning wasn't just a problem of housing. It was a much wider problem of an unsustainable society, unsustainable not just ecologically, but also in economic terms and indeed in social terms. And so modeling a new form of society we felt was the best way in which we could address that issue. So we bought a site of 22 hectares just next to the village, very ancient village of Cloughjordan in the Midlands of Ireland. And we have there developed a project of, we now have 55 houses, a community of about 100 adults, 35 children, and we build them according to an ecological charter that we ourselves developed. So that means we build them with very high levels of insulation. They're all south facing to avail of the heat of the sun, which even in an Irish climate heats our homes a lot of the year. We also have a district heating system, and that heats all our homes by renewable forms of energy. So this, of course, is another dimension of the problems that we face. We're taking back control over our energy system in doing that, and doing it in a way that's carbon neutral. We've also identified that the source of our food is a big problem for sustainability. And so therefore we have a community supported agriculture farm with members from the eco-village and from outside the eco-village, where we grow about 50 different varieties of fruit and vegetables. So we're modeling a very radically different way of using our land as against traditional forms of agriculture in Ireland. And we do this with 10 volunteers from the European Solidarity Corps that come for a year with us. So this is part of our educational offering of sharing what we do and depending also on these volunteers that come from all over Europe. We also have allotments where people grow their own food, and we have one of our members who is experimenting on our allotments with an experiment that he calls Red Gardens, Research, Education and Development. So he's showing new ways of growing in an Irish climate. All of this is an aid to biodiversity. So obviously another dimension of the problem we identify is the loss of biodiversity and the need in the way in which we build our homes, we heat our homes, we grow our food to foster all the time biodiversity. So we, for example, have a sensory garden. We have a new farm education center where the plan is to bring in more and more people, where we develop a whole new relationship with the natural environment. But of course, as I said at the beginning, sustainability is not just about environmental sustainability, it's also about economic sustainability. So we seek to grow local businesses. We have developed a bookshop, a coffee shop, a cooperative cafe, which has become a whole social hub for the wider village of Cloughjordan, an eco hostel, an award-winning bakery and baking school, which bakes bread like it was baked in Ireland in the Middle Ages, and during COVID, a new food hub to market the produce of the farm and the produce of so many of the artists and the craftspeople who live here. And as an aid to biodiversity, we've planted our own woodland of 17,000 trees. We maintain our land on permaculture principles. We seek to develop an edible landscape. All of this is modeling the ways in which one can, even in a small community like ours, transform our relationship with nature around us in a way that really does offer a whole new balance in our relationship with nature. And as an educational NGO, then we offer a place-based learning for schools, for universities, for community groups, both from Ireland and from abroad, to come and to share this experience, where we turn what is often seen as the threat of climate change and biodiversity loss so that people can see it as an opportunity. And COVID has allowed us now to put our educational offerings online. So this again is helps us to draw in wider groups of people to share our experience with. We've also developed an amphitheatre opened by the President of Ireland in April 2017, used for concerts, plays and festivals. But we have a long way to go, and I want to use in my second presentation to look at the challenges we still face, the lessons that we have learned. And so I'll leave that till the second part. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much again for just taking us almost full circle back to many of the key points that Isadora was also raising in terms of like really, you know, like working through this very compounded crisis where it's not just climate change, but the search for justice and for social and environmental justice is very, very imbricated and needs to go through everything: housing, the way we eat, the way we produce food, where we live, the shortening of change, the circular and social economies, and so on. We are going to, on the one hand, I just want to highlight, we already have a comment from Mulisa, and just to remind everyone that we very much welcome the possibility of just putting any questions or any comments that you might have directly there. So although we are on a webinar, if you do have a question, we will always invite to give you access you know, in terms of the camera and microphone, so we can have a closer to real dialogue, even if virtual. Many of you already, going back now to the panelists, many of you already started to talk to what was somehow the idea for the second part of the discussion, which had to do with what are, how is that your collectives and organizations are responding to the challenges identified, and in doing so, seeking transformative change. I guess that we can use the next 5 minutes allocated to each of you to just to go deeper into that. So Paidar, if you want to continue, we are going to reverse the order now. You are muted. Paidar, you are still muted.
Discúlpeme, estoy olvidando.
Sorry, apologies. I was saying that I will be speaking in Spanish because I think language diversity is closely linked to environmental diversity, and it's something that we should encourage. In this part, I will be highlighting the challenges we are still facing in our project, and I will share some lessons learned. I think these lessons are key when trying to respond to these big challenges. I think there are 3 big challenges. First is financial. We have developed plans in the middle of a financial and real estate boom in 2008, in the early 2000s, and when 2008, with the financial crisis, we were high in debts and with a lack of income, and we're moving out of this very slowly. Second challenge, planning. I think it's a problem we share throughout Europe and perhaps in other parts of the world, and that is that every alternative experimental initiative faces the challenges of complying with all of the administrative rules and procedures before receiving the necessary permits. We've been in this for years, and it's a big, big challenge for each alternative project. And the third challenge is construction. I mean, initially we started for a model that was based on individual purchases from our cooperative in the places where we build our homes. This was an option to avoid speculators from coming to buy land just to make a profit. But after the financial crash in 2008, this model no longer worked. So we had to build houses and apartments at a lower cost, also for rent, not just for purchase, and for much broader sectors than what we'd had until then. young people, people with low income, people with disabilities, refugees. So, and this required us to develop new skills in a community, in a situation where we had little extra money to meet this demand. We have survived as a cooperative during very tough years, but this was only possible by managing our finances in a very conservative way. So, what are the lessons we can take from this? Well, the first lesson I would say is that we chose a decentralized housing model in a commercialized, extremely commercialized society. We are always swimming upstream. And I think the most valuable lesson for me is that we've lived very difficult years with huge inequalities in the community. But to survive, we had to learn to strengthen community bonds and to develop resilience on a personal and on a community level to keep up our vision and the ideals that we had when we started off. I think we've managed this, but at a slow pace. And now, finally, we have financial plans and the steps to implement the project. We are engaged in plans with the municipality, but there are many dangers ahead. But the final lesson, which for me perhaps is the most important one, is that everything depends on staying true to the original vision, the values that moved you at the start, believing in the community, and to learn what it means to live in a community, in a radically interdependent community. I think it is the central point for all of the answers to these big challenges. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pedro. I would like to leave some time to talk to all. So I will call on Lucia to share some reflections. Thank you. Well, continuing with language diversity, I will be speaking Portuñol, so I apologize for the interpreters. And more specifically, I will refer to Kazanat and its role in the city and how we are confronting this legal process against us by Bolsonaro. We uh, have had some nice victories because they put a stop to this eviction to put our building on the housing market. And during this process, we were able to give our witness and to defend our project. And it was really beautiful because we were able to see that since it is a collective and intergenerational project where there is a lot of diversity of people and communities, Mbola communities, indigenous communities living in the cities, neighbors, and other social movements and social organizations, they all contributed to this transformation and construction. It was a collective construction. There were so many people from so many different areas. It could be researchers, historians, university professors from the Department of Urban Development, and the neighbors and the social movements. So that is how we were able to keep the process for 3 months until the government comes to a proposal. But the justice so far has halted the eviction. And right now we're trying to resist to keep this house as a permanent space for transformation. And as we can no longer organize the fair and bring people together in the city, we are using this house as a food distribution point. because we are gradually building a food purchase and distribution plan, because when the public policies were dismantled by Bolsonaro's administration, we had to articulate locally and do it ourselves. So that is why we came up with this initiative of making water available as a right, water that comes from a public company that they're trying to privatize, and making it available to people who couldn't stay at home during the pandemic and needed access to water. We were fiercely attacked. They stole some of our objects, and as all of the challenges in implementing an economic sanitation project, we always try that if we are facing challenges and discussing, we try using this to hold a discussion on public policies. So together with other local movements, we are drafting a true, real public access to water policy for people who are homeless out in the street. And I think the biggest strength in all of this is that we do this to support the landless, women, indigenous, quilombola movements in the city. We see this huge financialization, even the little nature that exists in the city. They're trying to financialize it to greenwash luxury economies. They're using it to say they're offsetting large infrastructures like airports. 5,000 people were evicted in the city, and they then buy carbon from the Amazon. They're trying to greenwash the financialization of nature. So we continue building our vision for a fairer city, a more ecological city, and a rights-based city to recover the lost city since the coup in 2016, always in close dialogue with allied organizations from around the world who share this principle of international solidarity. So Casanate will resist. Go, go, Casanate. Thank you so much, Lucia. We'll give the floor to David. I don't know if you'd like to continue with your initial present question, or do we look at the lessons learned and things you can share with us? Yes, thank you. I think we have connectivity issues perhaps with David. So we'll go to Isadora and we'll come back to you, David, in 5 minutes. Isadora? Sorry, I was muted again. So from Cooperación Comunitaria, we see housing as a process, a comprehensive global process with strong linkages to the environment, the territory, and the ways of living. So we see housing from this lens, and based on the work we do with organizations to manage housing for Cooperación Comunitaria, it's important to work with collectives. We have to look at families not as individual units, but as parts of a process where we can all learn and we can all develop stronger housing so that it can resist natural disasters better, and we give them stability also in the productive processes that allows rural communities to live from their land. So we are leading a participatory process with training that goes from coming up with a diagnosis, knowing how people live, how they consume, how they produce. We have participatory design, we have construction, and after the construction, we also look at how these spaces are used, how ownership was taken, how they're being used, and how we can improve these processes, always with full respect as to how people want to live. And working with a collective subject and in rural communities where there is a long-standing tradition in the way of doing and producing, it's very important to recover the collective ownership of land, especially to defend land from extractivism and initiatives that go against the communities and that displace the communities. We also organize for self-management, mutual support practices, and this has to do precisely with what Lucia was saying. It has to link it up to solidarity. We have to contribute to solidarity through mutual support. And then consensus-based decision-making. We have a discussion to think about things. We don't just simply vote on something to take a decision. And then traditional housing adapts to the social and cultural context, but climate change and greater threats are also important. So we bring in all of these elements through adapted technologies that allow us to strengthen these structures so that they are more resistant to natural disasters. And we have a participatory methodology for the reconstruction processes. It's much more complex because these reconstruction efforts, there are more stakeholders involved, we have less time. And we also look at how we can come up with campaigns. In the case of Oaxaca, there started to be demolitions. So we came up, we generated construction material banks so that we could reconstruct in these spaces. So it's also important to change our way of thinking, to restore, reconstruct, and recover the things we have and not just throwing them away and building from scratch. We know that these companies that are in capitalist cycles, they do not respect natural cycles. So, I mean, we, for instance, during this reconstruction, we were able to recover 178 houses. We rebuilt them, and they were much larger in terms of square meters. We recovered 48% of the cost, and as we used local materials, it was much more efficient in terms of thermal comfort, and this also contributes to savings in energy expenditure and CO2 emissions. So then there's the whole issue of knowledge exchange. I said it's very important to not just think about one single type of house built with industrialized material, because that is meaning that we only have one single constructive system where all knowledge is being lost. And we have to look at how we can adapt each construction to each place. We can't even think of regionalizing houses because the soil, the culture, the climate, the family needs change from one community to another. So we always need to observe, study, and research to adapt and to be truly sustainable. And we can't generate prototypes as they started doing in Mexico. So to wrap up, I think we need to think of timings that accompany the social and natural cycles, not just looking for efficient outcomes. And for this, we need to think in about qualities above quantity. Quality is much more important than quantity. And we have to think of places respecting the natural times and rhythms. We have to think about people's well-being above financial gains. We have to look at nature as a living being and not good, and we need to think of habitat as a part of our life. And we have to think of housing as a human right and not a tradable good. Thanks so much, Isadora. Okay, so we'll pass the floor to David to close the panel discussion and to open up the Q&As. David, I don't know if you're with us.
¿Puedes sumarte aunque sea sin cámara? ¿Sí?
Even if you don't have your camera on, can you hear me? Yes, great.
Nosotros para luchar contra el problema de producción capitalista de la ciudad, nuestra
firstly, we changed the power of our own city. 6 years ago, we started a project, and for months we've been working to train new leaders.
Y a partir de las necesidades y los intereses de la población,
and based on the interest of the local people, we started developing a new idea of city. So the idea was to change and to have depend more on the grassroots movements. We have a new association of over 200 people in our neighborhood and another association with over 1,000 members. And the second phase was to change our methodology, urban planning strategy and methodology. We thought we needed new tools, so we created an urban planning workshop. We thought that in order to change the city, we needed architects, experts in general, urban planners.
Capturada para los élites y la clase media. Entonces, es no una nueva idea, viene de Paul Davidoff y del hace años.
The city has to be for everyone who lives there, not just for elites. So using professionals and experts for a change, to create a change in the city needs to happen, needs to be included. We have also developed several strategies, co-building strategies, and our latest initiative has been having a referendum. This experience has been a finalist in the Transformative Cities Awards. The idea was to create an alternative to the destruction of social housing. Our mayor also participated 4 years ago in the Fearless Cities Awards, and he has been talking about how difficult it is to fight national urban planning policies. At this level, there's a conflict between local and national policies. So we thought we should create a mechanism. We should fight this idea, this neoliberal idea, which says that there isn't an alternative to what we have. So we thought a referendum would be a good idea to block the demolition national policy and also to create new alternatives. 2 years ago, we held this referendum after a long, month-long campaign, and over 200 people in the neighborhood voted in this referendum. They voted for or against the demolition of social housing. And there was a participation actually higher participation than during the local election and also in the neighborhood. So over 70% of the voters voted against demolishing social housing, public housing. So after this mechanism, this referendum, we thought this would be a good idea, a good tool in this fight between the local and national powers. So currently there aren't any demolitions planned in the neighborhood, but so that has been a success, but over 7% of public housing has been saved, let's say. So we've saved 7% of social housing in the neighborhood. Our idea of this local referendum has also other experiences in Berlin and Germany.
Los ciudadanos están autogestionados o referéndum local
are self-managing and self-promoting local referendums. They want to create a mechanism which could have also legal power and legal influence. And we think these ideas, having local referendums, could be a useful tool of common pressure to have better housing. This could be a tool for fairer, but also greener city. In the Anthropocene, we cannot afford ourselves to destroy more. Like architects say, actually the winner of the Edgar Award, he said we have to rebuild instead of debuild. Thank you very much.
Estoy segura que si
Thank you so much,
habría un aplauso.
David. I'm sure if we were all in the same room, there would be a huge round of applause after all of these interventions. Many important points have been mentioned.
Segura que vamos a seguir
and I'm sure there will be even more important and interesting points. We will be able to highlight more common challenges, but also common strategies with the participation of people in the audience. I think there's a common thread, which is these specific ideas. The struggle is to rebuild and have a different way of city, not a fast city in terms of fast food. Fighting this fast city is actually what is at heart of many of these initiatives, going against waste, going against financiarization, going against individualization. So the power is actually going against individualizing. Because building a common entity is what's really important. So before moving on to the next point, we wanted to share something that has something to do with some of the ideas that have been raised by some of you. I will be very short and very brief. I will be talking about the Habitat Voices, which is not a concrete experience like the ones that you have mentioned. This is more of a process which has been built thanks to the voices of many of you, social movements, academia, grassroots movements, popular movements, NGOs, etc. So at some point in May last year, in the midst of the pandemic, we didn't really know what was happening yet, but we saw the need to draft something together. And that's how this manifesto was born. Manifesto is called Habitat Voices. It's an open and living document. It was born in Latin America, but it traveled throughout the world to many other regions, and it's still being written. So in this sense, I won't have to read it because you have access to the document. It's in French, English, Arabic, Spanish. You have the short version, the long version as well. So I won't read it, but I would like to highlight some points. And I'd like to talk about and echo these voices that have been talking since May last year. So on the one hand, I think there's something very important among all of your presentations. When the manifesto was written, we had to redefine the pandemic. We are not talking about an isolated event. We're not just talking about a pandemic. We're not talking even about a health crisis. We're talking about systemic crises, which, as we know and as we have endlessly heard, they have not only unveiled inequalities and injustices, but they're also generating new ones. So there is this constant need to be versatile. There are new exclusion mechanisms, discrimination mechanisms. So this manifesto wants to create to echo this situation. There is a unifying factor of this crisis, which makes us all be together. These urgencies and these injustices are still alive despite the pandemic. Also in the pandemic, within the international sphere, we also started hearing, okay, so what should we do? In May 2020, they started saying we're close to having 2 lost decades. I don't know who's counting, but I think it might be even longer if we think about the SDGs. There's very, very important things that we have to discuss. There was also a call to a mobilization of financial resources through the international community and through the states, massively actually. In May 2020, they said this. They said, so before the vaccine, before everything that happened, before evictions, before destructions, they said we needed the equivalent to a 10% of the world GDP. So in the midst of all of this, there was also a call for collectivity. So what is the pandemic? And these enchainment of crises in terms of collective management, collective rights, and also related to the state. I want to talk about this because many of you mentioned it, the possibility of, or sort of like aligning the states with these destructive and violent processes. you mentioned many of the examples. People had to stay at home, but the evictions continued. So you see the contradictions that we still have, actually. We have been living them, but we still have them. So these call for these 5 points. What we want is to highlight the importance of continued communication amongst ourselves, but also with the state. We need to talk about care, we need to talk about solidarity, protection, etc. These issues can also be used as individualizing strategies. If we look at what happened, if we see what happened, which have been contention lines critical in the pandemic, we see that these lines have always been pushed for by civil society. And recently, with an even smaller group, we can talk of it as local, like new municipalities. So there's this call for states to assume their responsibility and to their responsibility in these processes to help get us out of these type of cities. We will go into depth. Just talking about this because we're in the high-level political forum at the UN, which is a great opportunity, actually, to talk directly to the states and to the international community about the type of change that we want to have as an alternative. So I invite you all to join us tomorrow at an event where we'll be talking into depth about these 5 points. So we have some questions. Melissa has been very active. She is from Ethiopia. Melissa, would you have the chance and the will to speak to the floor and ask your question? If not, I can ask the questions that Melissa wrote. Melissa from Ethiopia.
Can you identify any distinct challenges housing advocates face that are not common with other rights activation? No sé si alguno, podríamos hacer, hay una pregunta más, la voy a compartir, y hay otra intervención de Florencia, de Uruguay.
Another question, also a question from Florencia from Uruguay. She also has a question asking whether this discussion will be recorded to be able to share it with other colleagues. She also has a question. Actually, I'll read another question from Melissa, and then we'll open the floor for panelists. So first question is, can you identify any distinct challenges as housing advocates that they face, which are not common with other rights activation areas? And the second question, Melissa says,
society, Sub-Saharan Africa sees very few significantly impactful action, both from local and international actors. What was the experience of the panelists' national experience like at the start of housing advocacy, especially by civic society? So to talk a bit more about who are the allies that you have been working with. Where do you suggest as panelists that one starts in the middle of a myriad of problems related to housing that have not been dealt with before? Abro el... ¿Quién quiera empezar?
So whoever wants to take the floor, please do.
Está claro que todas han señalado que en realidad la vivienda no es un tema, ¿no?
So everyone has highlighted that housing itself is not a problem. We're talking about living. Of course, housing is a problem, but we're also talking about living. Many of you are working with housing habitat as a common point. Which are the challenges and also which are the opportunities which open this point?
Sí, Isadora.
Isadora, go ahead. Well, I could talk from the perspective of rural housing, which is obviously different from urban housing. In any case, we have found ways of developing other economies that do not involve money. And I think it's an interesting experience on how to collectivize housing and habitat, not just for the people themselves, but in relation to nature. Just to give you an example, in our construction, since we use local materials, the production of local materials by the population, this generates a local economy that doesn't depend on other foreign economies, and also labor, besides generating cooperation and new knowledge, and in these new ways of social organization, they all contribute to reducing production costs. And this in turn, in our case, we've seen 10 up to 40% savings in the housing costs. And we find it very interesting. Another point which we have been working on is that financing housing is very difficult. It's difficult to come across financing for the construction of these houses. So we together, we have state or public and private funds, and we pull it all together. And so we pool all of this money, and it allows us to produce more with greater contributions of raw materials and labor from the local community. And to conclude quickly, the use of local materials also fosters a deeper relationship with nature and to take greater care of our territory. We find a lot of knowledge on how these natural raw materials can be converted into construction materials, and also taking care of natural processes. What time of year is a good time to cut down trees or plant. So there are many other processes that aren't only linked to the habitat. Thanks. Peter, I think your hand was up.
Isadora is emphasizing exactly what I would feel we from our experience would put forward. First of all, I think if you identify housing as if it's a separate issue, divorced from the wider problems of the community, then I suppose it fragments and it pushes you down the road towards a more commodified understanding of housing. Like we would always say, we're building community, and of course, to build community, you need to give housing to people, and that those myriad of needs of building community and all the different aspects of it, livelihood, how we tend our locale, etc., how we maintain our land, what we grow on it, all of those are best dealt with from a bottom-up approach. And I think what Isadora has presented is so rich, and in some ways it shows that in like what we sometimes rather disparagingly call indigenous communities, but many people who live sort of on the edge of commodified society have so much more to bring to this discussion, so much more capacity and so much more sort of holistic understanding. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, is here I'm speaking as a citizen of one of the richest countries in the world, and yet a citizen of a country that's facing enormous problems of homelessness and of housing provision, where we see big multinational funds coming in and buying up housing because it's seen as a profitable investment. And there's a lot of struggles going on here now to force the government, and the government have very much had their back to the wall on this, to control these funds and to limit their capacity to buy up housing and therefore to push up the price of housing. It's very interesting, the struggles in our national politics. But we need both. We need the bottom up and the top down. And of course, what we're doing is confronting the dynamics of capitalism at this moment of crisis, where those who have money and those who want to invest identify housing, particularly in the more developed countries, as being a source of really making good profits, very solid profits, when the stock market isn't as reliable anymore, where we don't know what's happening with investing in fossil fuels. So this is a whole frente de lucha. It's a form of struggle that we really have to take on. But I think what's wonderful about this event is that we're breaking through these sort of barriers that we put between developed and developing, and realize that so much of the peoples on the margins of our organized society, people we call indigenous people or poor people, really have far more of the answers than those of us who have been so commercialized in our way of thinking about these basic needs, are far less able, really, have far less power to respond. I mean, that's what we in our community are trying to do, but it's always a struggle.
Thank you so much, Paider. I see Lucia's hand. We go next to you. Just to say, and just to throw in the pot, another question that comes from Diego. And you really touch upon that, Paider, but Diego is also asking, so please come back to Mulisa, what is particular about using housing as an entry point for transformation. But also Diego is asking if the panel thinks at all that the COVID-19 pandemic is opening a particular catalytic moment for more transformative action. Lucia, the floor is yours.
Bueno, primero quisiera decir que
first, I'd like to say this discussion on economic justice and reconstruction and making funds communal to change the structure of the system and placing life at the center and above profit is super interesting. And I think it's the only way, right? By collectivizing things, it's the only way of turning things around. I understood that one of the questions had to do with the issue of defenders. And in the context that Isadora was saying, in rural areas in Mexico, they are always under threat from corporate capture in the extractive industries. And that is also violent in cities where you have people who are homeless, but you also have indigenous urban indigenous communities and quilombolas, which for many, many decades have been asking to reclaim and recover their territories. They have to be collective territories. It's not private property, very often the property goes to the man and not to the women, and they want to be able to take decisions on their territory and their future. And we see a strong process of criminalization of social activists and defenders. We see a criminalization of politics. How can we take back the conditions to build a better future without democracy? We see fascism that criminalizes politics in Porto Alegre, but in many cities in Brazil. And I think this happened too in the United States. People recovered and reoccupied politics. And now in Brazil, our city councillors have changed. We have a lot of young people, we have colored people, which is much more representative of the society in Brazil. And this has made a big difference. There are also social leaders. They also face challenges, very tough processes ahead. But these young new councillors are our preferences, and they don't stand alone. The better we articulate them, the more we support these and collective mandates, well, this is also useful to stop invisibilizing the violence, because with the pandemic, they're saying, okay, there's no more public transport to such and such a neighborhood because it's very violent or because everyone is a drug dealer there. I mean, this oppression of violence and racism makes people lose their self-esteem and their hope of changing anything. So being together, not making things invisibilized. Someone was also asking how we can articulate better in our struggle for housing, because it's one of our human rights and it's a universal human right. So we have to articulate in processes such as fearless cities. Thanks so much, Lucia. I know we have reached our time limit. It always happens that we run out of time. But before concluding, I'd like to give Josephine the floor to tell us how we will continue this discussion. I'd like to thank you all for showing in such clear ways that there is no space and time to just put some makeup on this broken system. We have to build a new system, and it has to be inclusive, and we have to look at what we need to know and do. And we've seen many examples in this afternoon's session in different contexts. So on my behalf, thank you so much for this experience today. Apologies, Josephine.
My failure to keep things on time, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adriana, and thank you so much to everyone from my side too. I think it was a really rich and deep discussion. So yeah, really great to listen to. And I don't want to prolong it very much. I just want to take a few minutes to share with you some continued opportunities to connect and to learn together and to advocate. So some different opportunities. The first one, of course, is the Transformative Cities Award 2021, which will start this year in September. So we would like to invite you all to apply if you are part of an initiative that is doing transformative work in the categories housing or water, energy or food, or of course share this opportunity with any initiatives you may know in your local context to apply. And you can subscribe to our newsletter in order to stay updated when exactly the award applications are opening, but it will be sometime in September. It's an opportunity to learn together, or actually two opportunities from Transformative Cities partner organizations. So the first one is from Equalize, from the Communities for Future, the European Network for Community-led Initiatives on Climate Change and Sustainability. Equalize has a space that offers resources and inspiration, and also an online space where initiatives active in housing and also other issues can collaborate with other like-minded initiatives. And there will be an action day in September as well, which is the European Day of Sustainable Communities, with actions across many different countries. And we will also share a link in the chat for you to see how to become active and how to connect with other initiatives there. And then there are HIC co-learning spaces. So HIC is organizing 3 different co-learning spaces where organizations can join. And they will run over 3 months with group learning sessions once or twice a month. and they're structured along 3 different themes that also came up in the discussions today. So one is feminist approaches to habitat, one is land rights, and one is multi-level advocacy. And it's not meant as an expert session where people can learn from so-called experts, but it's more and the idea is to learn from each other as equals and to share experience with each other. So you can look at the HIC website or follow HIC on social media to wait for the invitations that will come in the next few weeks. And then lastly, 2 opportunities to advocate, which we find quite important to share with you. So one which Adriana already talked about, so I will just mention it really briefly, is that tomorrow the manifesto which Adriana introduced will be introduced at the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. And this will happen tomorrow from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Central European time. So you can sign up to that as well via a link that we will share in the chat to stay part of the discussion and to basically advocate and put pressure on the UN. And then finally, we would like to share with you an opportunity for local authorities or city administrators to advocate for a binding treaty, the UN binding treaty for corporations with respect to human rights, which is basically a process that has been going on for 7 years now to make establish a treaty that will put an end to global loopholes in international human rights law and ensure that corporations can be held legally accountable for human rights violations and environmental crimes, which I think is basically one of the main issues that were talked about today as well by our panel. So basically local authorities or city administrators can now sign a call for this binding treaty and urge states and regional organizations to pursue negotiations in this UN process. And we will share the link to that as well in the chat. Yeah, so that was very, very quickly, basically opportunity to stay connected, because we think today that should not be a one-off event, but rather the start of a process in which we continue to exchange and hopefully also hear from your experiences. And I would just like to very much thank our speakers today for sharing their time and for sharing their experiences. And also those of you who asked questions and who shared your experiences with us. And of course, would like to thank Adriana for the great moderation and your insights that you shared with us, and our whole background team of Yolande, Irene, Sophia, Satoko, and Jess, and Monica and David, who were translating for us today. So yeah, to close this, thank you so much for joining again, and we wish you a very good day or good evening wherever you are joining us from, and hope that you will stay connected to Transformative Cities. So thank you very much.
Adios. Gracias.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you all. Thank you. Goodbye.